blood-stained leather and a grim reputation were all Dalton Hayes knew until a trembling 6-year-old girl tugged on his patched vest. She didn't see a hardened Hell's Angel criminal. She saw a giant who could stop the monster trailing her. What happened next shattered every stereotype and broke hearts worldwide. Neon signs buzzed with a dying, erratic hum over the cracked asphalt of a Spokane convenience store. Cold October rain slicked the pavement, reflecting the harsh fluorescent glare from inside the shop. Leaning against a heavily customized matte black Harley-Davidson was Dalton Hayes. At 42, Dalton was a mountain of a man, his face weathered by years of harsh winds bar fights and a stint in San Quentin. Across his broad back, the infamous Death's Head logo of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club was stitched into thick, road-worn leather. He was a patched member, a road captain, and a man who strictly minded his own dangerous business. Lighting a crumpled cigarette, Dalton exhaled a thick plume of grey smoke into the freezing air, his ice-blue eyes scanning the deserted street. He was waiting for his brothers to finish fueling up down the road, perfectly content with the hostile isolation his appearance usually granted him. People crossed the street to avoid Dalton. Cops looked the other way. He was a ghost in the criminal underworld, a man whose violent past was written in the jagged scars across his knuckles and the rigid set of his jaw. Footsteps light and erratic broke the rhythmic patter of the freezing rain. Dalton didn't immediately turn. He merely shifted his gaze, expecting a desperate panhandler or a lost drunk. Instead, he saw a pair of light-up sneakers, the LEDs, flickering weakly. Above the sneakers were thin legs in muddy denim, and above that, an oversized, faded pink winter coat that looked like it had been pulled from a donation bin. It was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Her blonde hair was plastered to her forehead by the rain, and her pale, dirt-smudged face was streaked with fresh tears. In her tiny, trembling hands, she clutched a filthy, one-eyed stuffed rabbit. Dalton frowned, a deep, intimidating scowl creasing his features. He instinctively looked around for a frantic mother, a careless father, anyone. The parking lot was dead. The street was empty. "Beat it, kid!" Dalton grunted, his voice like grinding gravel. He wasn't a babysitter. The life he led left absolutely no room for children, not since he lost his own little sister Lily, decades ago, to the very streets he now ruled. The little girl didn't run. She didn't flinch at his terrifying tone. Instead, she took a step closer, close enough that Dalton could see the absolute, paralyzing terror in her wide hazel eyes. She reached out with a tiny freezing hand and grabbed the heavy leather of his biker vest. "Mister," she whispered, her voice shaking violently. "Are you a bad guy?" Dalton paused, the cigarette burning down toward his calloused fingers. He looked at the heavy silver rings on his hands, the tattoos crawling up his neck, the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. "Depends on who you ask, little bird. Now where are your parents? It's 2 a.m. "My mom is at work." The girl stammered, her grip on his leather tightening until her knuckles turned white. "She works at the diner. I was supposed to wait at Mrs. Gable's house, but he came." Dalton's eyes narrowed. The hardened criminal instincts inside him flared instantly to life. "Who came?" The little girl swallowed hard, pointing a shaking finger toward the pitch-black alleyway directly across the street. "The bad man. He's been following me since the bus stop. He tried to grab my arm, but I bit him and ran. He's right there, in the dark." Dalton dropped his cigarette, crushing it slowly beneath his heavy leather boot. He didn't make any sudden movements, but his eyes shifted toward the shadows across the street. At first there was nothing but the pouring rain and the darkness, but then a distinct shift in the gloom, the faint orange cherry of a lit cigar, the outline of a broad-shouldered man wearing a heavy trench coat, standing perfectly still behind a rusted dumpster, watching them. "What's your name, kid?" Dalton asked, his voice dropping an octave, losing all its previous gruffness. "Ruby," she squeaked. "Ruby," Dalton repeated softly. "And why did you come to me?" Ruby looked up at his terrifying face, her innocent eyes locking onto his. "Because you look scarier than he does. Will you walk me home, please?" A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the gas station. Hell's Angels didn't do charity. They didn't escort little girls through the slums of Spokane. If Dalton's chapter president found out he was playing White Knight, he'd be the laughingstock of the clubhouse, or worse. But as Dalton looked down at Ruby shivering in the freezing rain, holding on to him, like he was the last anchor in a drowning world, something ancient and fiercely protective snapped awake inside his chest. He looked back at the shadow across the street. The man took a step forward, stepping just onto the edge of the sidewalk, his intent clear. Dalton slowly unzipped his heavy leather jacket, revealing the dark handle of a combat knife strapped to his chest. He looked down at Ruby and offered her a massive, scarred hand. "All right, Ruby," Dalton said, his voice cold, as the grave but completely gentle as he spoke to her. "Show me the way, and don't let go of my hand." Ruby slipped her tiny freezing fingers into his massive palm. As soon as Dalton stepped away from the Harley, stepping out from the neon light and onto the wet pavement, he locked eyes with the man across the street. Dalton didn't say a word, but the feral, murderous glare he shot the stalker was a universal language. It promised absolute, unmitigated violence. The walk home had begun. The rain intensified as Dalton and Ruby navigated the labyrinth of decaying brick buildings and flickering streetlights. The neighborhood was a notorious stretch of Spokane, known as the Bottoms, a place where the police rarely patrolled. After midnight, a graveyard of forgotten people and desperate crimes. Dalton walked with a slow, deliberate, heavy gait. His senses were dialed up to a razor's edge. He kept Ruby on his left side, shielded from the road, while his right hand hung loosely near his waist, ready to draw steel at a fraction of a second's notice. "You live far from here, Ruby?" Dalton asked quietly, his eyes darting down alleyways and scanning rooftops. "Just past the old train tracks," Ruby replied, her voice gaining a tiny fraction of confidence now that she was tethered to this mountain of a man. "Apartment 4B, the one with the yellow door. Mum says yellow means hope." Dalton felt a bitter pang in his chest. Hope was a commodity that had dried up in the Bottoms a long time ago. "Your mum, she leaves you with a sitter, usually. Mrs. Gable." Ruby nodded, but Mrs. Gable fell asleep on the couch. She drank her special juice and wouldn't wake up. So I tried to walk to the diner to find Mum. That's when the man in the coat started following me. Rage, hot and white, flared in Dalton's gut. The sheer vulnerability of this child wandering these ravenous streets alone was sickening, but the rage was immediately replaced by a chilling, tactical awareness. He heard it before he saw it, the low, grinding hum of an engine operating without headlights. Dalton casually glanced over his shoulder. 2 blocks back, crawling along the curb like a predatory shark in deep water, was a dark, rusted sedan. It was pacing them. The man from the alley hadn't given up. He had just called for backup. This wasn't a random creep looking for a quick snatch and grab. This was a targeted operation. Somebody specifically wanted this little girl. "Ruby," Dalton said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "We're going to play a game. When I say go, I want you to duck behind those trash cans right there. Cover your eyes and count to 20 out loud." "Can you do that?" Ruby looked up her lower lip, trembling again. She saw the grim determination in Dalton's eyes. "Are the bad men coming?" Not to you. Never to you. Dalton swore, dropping to one knee so he was eye level with her. Count to 20. Loud enough so I can hear you. Go. Ruby scrambled behind a stack of overflowing industrial dumpsters, pressing her face into her hands. 1, 2, 3. Dalton stepped out from the sidewalk and walked straight into the middle of the dark, rain-slicked street. He stood perfectly still, a massive, imposing silhouette against the dying street lamps, directly in the path of the approaching sedan. The driver slammed on the brakes, the tires shrieking against the wet asphalt. The car skidded to a halt mere feet from Dalton's boots. The engine idled loudly. Through the rain-streaked windshield, Dalton could see two men, the driver and the man in the heavy trench coat in the passenger seat. Dalton didn't draw a weapon. He didn't shout. He simply walked to the driver's side window and punched his heavily ringed fist straight through the safety glass. The glass shattered inward with an explosive crunch. Before the driver could even scream, Dalton grabbed the man by the collar of his shirt, hauling him halfway out of the broken window. Blood from the shattered glass smeared the doorframe. 14, 15, 16. Ruby's tiny voice echoed from the alley. The passenger in the trench coat scrambled to pull a revolver from his coat, but Dalton was faster. With his left hand, Dalton reached through the shattered window, grabbed the steering wheel, and vaulted his massive body up, kicking his heavy steel-toed boot straight through the windshield, striking the passenger squarely in the chest. The man gasped, the gun clattering to the floorboards. Dalton dragged the coughing, bleeding driver out of the window, completely tossing him onto the wet asphalt like a rag doll. He planted his boot on the man's throat, applying just enough pressure to cut off his air supply. "Who sent you?" Dalton hissed the Hell's Angel patch on his back, seeming to leer in the darkness. "Give me a name, or you take your last breath on this pavement." The driver clawed desperately at Dalton's boot, his eyes bulging. "Warren," he choked out, spitting blood. "Warren sent us. He gets out of state prison tomorrow. He told us to secure the kid before the mother skips town." Dalton froze. Warren. The name hit him like a physical blow. He knew that name. Everyone in the Spokane underworld knew Warren the Butcher. Hayes. Dalton's blood ran colder than the October rain. Warren was his estranged, violently psychopathic younger brother. The brother Dalton had disowned a decade ago after Warren crossed lines even the angels wouldn't tolerate. If Warren was Ruby's father, then Ruby was Dalton's niece. 17, 18, 19. Dalton lifted his boot. He leaned down his face, inches from the terrified driver. "You tell Warren that if he comes within 50 miles of Spokane, the Hell's Angels will hunt him down, and tell him his brother has the girl." Dalton stood up, ignoring the groans of the men in the car. He walked back to the alley just as Ruby peeked out from behind her hands. 20, she whispered. "Good job, kid." Dalton said, his voice remarkably steady, despite the hurricane of realization tearing through his mind. He wiped a smear of blood off his leather jacket before she could see it, and offered his hand again. "Let's get you home." They walked the remaining 4 blocks in silence. Dalton's mind raced. He had unknowingly stumbled into his own dark family history. The little girl gripping his hand was his own flesh and blood, a forgotten legacy of a brother he wished was dead. He had to get her to her mother. He had to get them out of the city tonight. They finally reached a dilapidated 4-story apartment building that looked like it was slowly sinking into the earth. The fire escapes were rusted husks. The hallway lights flickered ominously. "Second floor," Ruby whispered, pointing up the stairwell. Dalton led the way, his hand now firmly resting on the grip of the heavy pistol tucked into his waistband. The stairwell smelled of stale beer and damp rot. As they reached the second-floor landing, Dalton's heart skipped a beat. Apartment 4B. The door with the faded yellow paint. It was standing wide open. The wood around the deadbolt was violently splintered. Deep gouge marks scarred the doorframe, indicating it had been kicked in with massive force. The apartment inside was pitch black, utterly silent, except for the faint sound of crying coming from deep within the shadows. Dalton pushed Ruby behind his massive frame, drawing his weapon in a fluid, practiced motion. The men in the car were just the B team. Somebody else had beaten them to the apartment. "Stay right behind my legs, Ruby." Dalton breathed, his voice a lethal whisper. "Do not make a sound." Dalton stepped over the threshold, his boots crunching softly on broken porcelain scattered across the entryway. He raised his weapon, stepping into the darkness of the living room, ready to unleash hell. Stepping through the ruined doorway, Dalton Hayes felt the familiar icy calm of impending violence wash over him. His heavy boots made no sound against the threadbare carpet of the hallway as he moved deeper into the oppressive darkness of apartment 4B. The smell of cheap whiskey, old dust and fresh copper hung thickly in the stagnant air. Every muscle in his massive frame was coiled tight, ready to unleash devastating force. Behind his muscular legs, tiny Ruby clung to the damp leather of his heavy duster, her terrified breathing the only sound breaking the horrific silence. Dalton raised his heavy, semi-automatic pistol, sweeping the narrow corridor. A jagged sliver of pale moonlight slashed through a broken window in the living room, illuminating the chaotic wreckage inside. Overturned bookshelves, shattered lamps, and violently torn upholstery painted a vivid picture of a desperate struggle. In the center of the devastated room stood a mountain of a man wearing a dripping wet, olive-drab tactical jacket. His massive scarred hand was twisted viciously into the blonde hair of a woman kneeling on the floor, her face bruised and streaked with blood. This had to be Evelyn Ruby's mother. "Where is the kid?" "Evelyn." The man growled his voice, a guttural menacing rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. He violently yanked her head backward, pressing the cold steel of a serrated hunting knife against her trembling throat. "Warren wants his property. You know how he gets when he is denied. Tell me where she went, or I start carving." Dalton did not issue a warning. He did not shout for the man to drop his weapon. In his brutal world, hesitation was the quickest path to a shallow grave. He smoothly stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, locking his heavy combat boot aggressively into the floorboard. He closed the distance in 3 massive, terrifying strides. Before the mercenary could even register the colossal shadow descending upon him, Dalton struck. With blinding speed, Dalton brought the heavy steel barrel of his pistol crashing down against the back of the mercenary's skull. The brutal, sickening crack of metal meeting bone echoed like a gunshot in the tiny apartment. The man's eyes instantly rolled back into his head, his grip completely releasing Evelyn's hair as his massive body crumpled to the floor like a puppet with its strings abruptly cut. He hit the ground heavily, completely unconscious before his face smashed into the ruined coffee table. Evelyn collapsed forward, gasping frantically for air, her shaking hands clutching her bruised throat. She scrambled backward against the wall, her terrified eyes darting from the unconscious giant bleeding on her floor to the terrifying leather-clad biker who had just materialized from the shadows. She saw the grim death's head patch stitched onto his vest, the heavy silver rings covering his knuckles, and the cold, unyielding violence burning in his icy blue eyes. "Mommy!" Ruby's high-pitched, desperate cry shattered the tension. The little girl darted out from behind Dalton's massive legs, sprinting across the glass-strewn floor and throwing her tiny arms around her mother's neck. Evelyn gasped, burying her weeping face into Ruby's dirty blonde hair, rocking the child back and forth as heavy, ragged sobs tore through her chest. Dalton holstered his heavy weapon, keeping his eyes firmly locked on the doorway. He reached down, grabbing the unconscious mercenary by his tactical vest and dragging his dead weight effortlessly into the cramped kitchen, tossing him out of sight. Who are you?" Evelyn stammered, her voice raspy and raw. She pulled Ruby tighter against her chest, her wide eyes frantically scanning Dalton's weathered face. Suddenly, a flash of horrifying recognition crossed her features. She saw the identical rigid jawline, the exact same piercing blue eyes, and the familiar dangerous scowl. "Oh dear God, you're him. You're Warren's brother. You're the Hell's Angel." "My name is Dalton," he said softly, his deep voice carrying a strange, unexpected gentleness. "And I haven't been Warren's brother in over 10 years, not since he crossed lines that made even the devil flinch." Evelyn trembled violently, pressing her back flush against the peeling wallpaper. "Did he send you? Are you here to finish what his goons started? Warren swore he would take Ruby away from me the absolute second he got out of state prison. He swore he would make me suffer." "Warren didn't send me," Dalton interrupted, dropping to one knee so he was on their level, carefully avoiding any sudden aggressive movements. "I was at a gas station 10 blocks from here. Ruby found me. She walked right up to me in the freezing rain and asked me to protect her from the scumbag tailing her. She was brave, Evelyn. Braver than most grown men I ride with." Evelyn looked down at her daughter in absolute disbelief. "You found him? Ruby, he is a dangerous man." "He kept me safe, Mommy," Ruby whispered, looking back at Dalton with absolute, unwavering trust. "He made the bad men go away." Dalton reached into his heavy leather jacket, pulling out a clean, folded bandana. He offered it to Evelyn, gesturing silently to the deep cut above her eyebrow. "Warren gets released tomorrow morning at dawn. He clearly sent his lapdogs ahead of time to secure the two of you. If he finds you here, he will kill you, and he will drag this little girl into a world of absolute horror. We need to leave. Now." "Leave?" Evelyn choked out a bitter, desperate laugh. "Leave and go exactly where I have $40 to my name. My rusted car was repossessed 3 weeks ago. Warren has eyes on every bus station and train depot in this miserable city. I have absolutely nowhere to run." Dalton stood up slowly, his towering frame seemingly filling the entire room. He pulled a heavy battered flip phone from his pocket, dialing a memorized number. He looked down at the mother and daughter, seeing the broken ghosts of his own past staring back at him. He saw his late sister Lily in Evelyn's desperate, hopeless eyes. He was absolutely not going to let history repeat itself. "You aren't running alone," Dalton stated firmly, pressing the phone to his ear. "I have a family of my own, and tonight they ride for you." Heavy rain continued to relentlessly hammer the cracked asphalt as Dalton led Evelyn and Ruby out the back fire escape, navigating the treacherous rusted metal stairs with meticulous care. The storm provided a perfect chaotic cover, masking their swift movements as they sprinted through the flooded alleyways. Dalton kept his heavy pistol, drawn, his piercing eyes scanning every shadow, every parked car, and every rooftop. 2 miles across the city, inside a heavily fortified windowless compound, surrounded by barbed wire and security cameras, the Spokane chapter of the Hells Angels was mobilizing. Dalton had made a single 2-minute phone call to Bobby, his fiercely loyal chapter president. He had briefly explained the situation, expecting immense pushback. Instead, Bobby simply asked for their exact coordinates. The club operated entirely outside the bounds of traditional law, but they adhered strictly to their own brutal, unbending code of honor. Hunting women and children was a permanent, unforgivable violation of that code. Dalton guided them toward an abandoned, collapsing warehouse situated strictly on the industrial edge of the Spokane River. As they slipped through a rusted side door into the pitch-black interior, Evelyn collapsed against a concrete pillar, completely exhausted, her breathing ragged and shallow. Ruby clung desperately to Dalton's massive hand, refusing to let go of the giant who had promised her safety. A sudden deafening roar shattered the ambient noise of the heavy storm. Evelyn screamed softly, instinctively shielding Ruby as the massive rolling thunder of heavy motorcycle engines echoed off the damp brick walls. Suddenly, the large industrial bay doors rolled upward with a violent screech. 6 heavily customized Harley-Davidsons rumbled into the warehouse, their blinding high-beam headlights piercing the suffocating darkness. The bikers abruptly cut their engines. The ensuing silence was instantly filled with the heavy, intimidating thud of leather boots hitting the concrete. Bobby, a massive, heavily bearded man sporting a fresh scar across his throat, walked directly up to Dalton. He completely ignored Evelyn and Ruby, his dark eyes locked solely on his road captain. "Warren is officially a dead man walking—" Bobby grunted, pulling a thick, heavy envelope from his leather vest and shoving it forcefully into Dalton's chest. Club voted unanimously. Nobody touches family, even the estranged ones. Inside is $10,000 in unmarked, untraceable cash. There are 2 brand-new forged passports, a set of burner phones, and the keys to a secure, off-the-grid cabin up in the Canadian Rockies. The property belongs to a friendly chapter in Alberta. Nobody will ever look for them there. Dalton nodded solemnly, gripping Bobby's massive shoulder in a silent, profound gesture of absolute gratitude. "I owe you my life, brother." "You don't owe me a damn thing," Bobby replied gruffly, spitting a wad of tobacco onto the floor. "You just make sure they get out of the state alive. 2 of our prospects are waiting out back in an unmarked armored transport van. They will drive them over the border tonight." Dalton turned around to face Evelyn. He handed her the thick, heavy envelope. Her bruised hands violently shook as she realized exactly what was inside. It was absolute, unadulterated freedom. It was a completely new life, far away from the horrors of Warren and the suffocating darkness of Spokane. A message of absolute survival. "Do not ever contact anyone from your past." Dalton instructed, his voice serious and commanding. "You burn your old phones. You use the cash solely for gas and food until you cross the Canadian border. Once you reach the cabin, you stay put. You never look back. Understand?" Evelyn openly wept, clutching the heavy envelope tightly to her chest. She stepped forward and surprisingly threw her arms around Dalton's massive waist, burying her bruised face into his patched leather vest. "Thank you. God bless you, Dalton. You are truly our guardian angel." Dalton awkwardly patted her back, completely unaccustomed to such raw, genuine affection. He gently pulled away and dropped down to one knee, looking directly into Ruby's wide hazel eyes. "You be a good girl for your mum, little bird," Dalton whispered, reaching out to gently tap the nose of her filthy, one-eyed stuffed rabbit. "You stay brave." Ruby suddenly leaned forward, wrapping her tiny, freezing arms tightly around his thick, muscular neck. She kissed his rough, scarred cheek. "I love you, Uncle Dalton." The word struck him with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. Uncle Dalton. He closed his eyes tightly, feeling a strange hot tear suddenly mix with the freezing rain dripping from his hair. For the very first time in his violent, chaotic life, the Hells Angel felt a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute peace. He watched closely as Evelyn and Ruby climbed safely into the back of the waiting transport van, the heavy metal doors slamming shut officially, sealing their new future. As the armored van slowly pulled out of the warehouse, and disappeared completely into the dark, stormy night, Dalton Hayes fired up his Harley. The monstrous engine roared to absolute life beneath him. He was returning strictly to the shadows, but as he rode violently into the cold rain, his heart felt undeniably lighter. Did this story of a hardened biker risking everything to save a little girl touch your heart? Dalton Hayes proved that in the darkest shadows, a spark of humanity shines brightest. If you were moved by this unbelievable tale of unexpected heroism and fierce protection, please smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and definitely subscribe to our channel for more true gripping stories. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an inspiring new upload.